And we are live. My name is Nicholas Kotar. I am an epic fantasy author of novels inspired by Russian fairy tales. And I am here today talking with Christian Cameron, who goes by Miles Cameron in the epic fantasy world. I'm very happy to have Christian back here a second time. The first time we talked for almost 2 hours on all kinds of wonderful topics, and I'm sure today's conversation is going to be just as fascinating and just as engaging. Christian, it's good to have you here. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you very much for having me, Nathan. You do these things, and I always enjoy them thoroughly. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. I'm so glad. Well, a little bit of a reminder to those who don't know. My interaction with Christian began about a year and a half ago when I think out of the blue I emailed him with possibly a review of one of his books. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was one of these shot in the dark kind of things that young and impressionable and slightly stupid authors do to more established authors, hoping that somebody will actually grab onto the offered bait. And Christian was you were very gracious, and we started to communicate a little bit, and that was sort of the beginning of what I think is a little bit of a beautiful friendship. So I'm glad that you're back here with me today. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're writing right now and what you've recently published?
Well, the broad smile on my face is because I'm not writing anything right now because I finished a book yesterday.
Oh, congratulations.
And, it is my 41st book, but I have to say that I enjoy the feeling of finishing them exactly the same way on the 41st as I did on the first. It's just a great feeling, and it's a great way to enter the Christmas spirit. I'm a big fan of Christmas, and I really like to enjoy Christmas and finishing a book. So yesterday I finished a historical novel, which will probably, but not for certain, be called Hawkwood's Sword. It's book 5 of the William Gold series, known to my publisher, but no one else, as the Chivalry series.
Okay.
And it's a very, very, very complicated political novel. I promise there's enough combat scenes to entice the readers who want a good sword fight, but it's about Italian politics in the 14th century. It has a genuine murder mystery that really happened, the death of the Duke of Clarence, who was an English prince who was or wasn't murdered by somebody, and I won't say who, and played a major role in politics. And of course, I've also got John Hawkwood, and most fans of the 14th century know who that is. So that's what I was writing. I'll be starting a secret project tomorrow. And that's I'm going to leave it a secret for a little while longer. And I'm going to write a bunch of Tom Swans this winter for people who are fans of Tom Swan. I'm writing a 24-chapter free fantasy novel that people can download for free on my website if they sign up for my newsletter. There's a Christmas story. See, I'm just going to go on and on.
You go, absolutely.
There's a Christmas story in the Traitor Son series.
Oh, that's exciting.
It actually takes place after the end of the last novel.
Okay.
So it's really new material. And that will be available for free at midnight on Christmas Eve on my website. Merry Christmas, everyone. And what most recently published is Bright Steel, which came out in North America like 3 days ago.
Yeah,
I want to say
that's right.
Just had a launch party at Back of Phoenix. And so that completes the trilogy about Aranther and Dahlia. There might be more Aranther and Dahlia in the future. I'm only saying this because somebody asked me, I think day before yesterday, and the answer is, of course, I'll write more. I left them all alive at the end.
How could you? Something happened. Something went wrong. What was the idea for the Masters and Mages series? How did you, was it a natural sort of continuation of the thing that you started with the Traitor Son, or was this something completely different?
It was something completely different, mostly because I wanted to talk about very modern problems like race and nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I'm going to admit, for the writers and would-be writers out there, I think I give the impression, because I write quickly, that I never have writing problems. So instead, I'd like to talk about having a giant writing problem.
Yes, wonderful.
I sold to my editor and then started to write what was almost literally a swordsmanship fantasy novel. It was going to be about a maestro who had a terrible disease and was dying and was searching for the perfect student to take over his salle d'armes.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't going to be a particularly likable character. He was going to be a very, very difficult, driven man, like some of the maestros I've known.
And this was going to be the main character?
He wasn't going to understand that what he was doing was against the backdrop of something very like the French or Greek revolutions. So there were going to be all these things that he didn't care about going on in the background as he desperately sought for the perfect swords person. And that didn't end up being the novel I wrote. I wrote about 5 chapters of that novel. And 5 chapters in, I discovered that the main character that I thought I was going to have was probably the bad guy. And that this ingenue, who was actually going to be a sort of comic character who was going to float in and be too bad a swordsman to even make it. Why was he even there? But he had beat one of the other candidates by luck and strength of body. But you have to understand, I'm a passionate swords person. I kept wanting to make points about how sword fighting actually works. Yeah. Maybe not so often in fantasy novels. And 5 chapters in, I realized that wasn't the book I was writing. I was writing actually about this guy named Aranther, the ingenue, the incompetent swordsman, and Dahlia, who was going to be the person who wasn't a good enough swords person because she was a woman, because I was going to have, and then they took over the novel, and then I rewrote the whole beginning and went, fine, it's a different novel. I'm writing a different novel. So the book was originally going to be called The Master. It was going to be a single volume, and it was going to be set against what you and I and no one else would recognize as the Greek Revolution of the 1820s. Yeah. A fantasy version of the Greek Revolution. But if you know your Greek Revolution, it was not very efficient, not very effective, and kind of went running off madly in all directions. Yeah. And that was going to be the backdrop. It's not what happened. So I guess what I want to say to writers is it's okay to fail, because I totally failed to write that book, but I'm very pleased with the book I ended up writing after I threw a lot out.
So the question then naturally is, you could probably do this because you already have an established relationship with an editor. So maybe this is something you don't recommend to writers before they have either an established readership, if they're going independent, or if they have a very good relationship with their publisher, or is there a secret here that I'm missing?
So my editor on this was Gillian Redfern, and she was never anything but courteous and accepting when I said, actually, it's looking like this now. And I guess what I would say is to have a good relationship with your editor, but to allow yourself to write the best book you can write. And if that doesn't turn out, like, it's interesting. I think first-time writers usually go in with a book written.
Yeah.
So I think we're talking about second or third time writers here.
Sure. Yeah.
But I also think that the process of modern mainstream publishing, which is that you provide a synopsis, a character list, and a sort of an outline, maybe a couple of chapters. And I'm talking about being a modestly established writer. You've written 1 book or 2 books. Yeah. It can be a false one. And I think other people would back me on this, because if that's all you've done on your novel, 150 pages later, you may be saying, that didn't work. And that wasn't my best idea. And now I've had a much better idea. And I guess that's what happened to me this time. It's not even the first time. It's just the most powerful time.
So do you then, are you what is called a discovery writer? Do you outline it all? Do you try to set a scene beforehand? How does it work for you?
Yeah, I am a discovery writer, but at the same time, I'm going to tell you a story because I'm a storyteller.
Good. Excellent.
I had a fabulous babysitter when I was a kid. And here's, if anyone knows Sam Burrell in Iowa City, Iowa, please say hi. I owe my entire career to Sam. So to get me to go to bed, Sam would always tell me a story. And then I think because he'd started dating someone and just didn't have the long evenings, he started saying, like, pal, can you tell yourself a story? Let me give you the setup. There's the hero and another guy in a canoe, and they're going down a river headed towards a waterfall. There you are. That's the setup. Good night. And he'd walk out of my bedroom.
That's awesome.
I would, in fact, tell myself those stories. and they were pretty lame, I
Yeah,
imagine, and they got better. And after a while, this may be too much information. I always put myself to bed by telling myself a story.
that's amazing.
And at some point, even in that process, I realized that there was a matter of process, and you could get like some number of imaginary paragraphs into telling your own story and go, no, there's no mountains. It's not mountains. Um, uh, uh, what I'm trying to say is that is discovery when you're
Yeah,
literally just telling a story as you go along. But at the same time, especially as I age, I'm going to be super honest here. I used to be able to hold the whole idea of a novel in my head. I didn't write anything down, and I just sat down and wrote the whole thing out. Um, I'm 57. I can't hold the whole thing in my head anymore.
yeah.
So I now write quite complete outlines. Now, I
Okay.
know people who write 50-page outlines. I write more like a 9-page outline. Um, but I outline fairly meticulously. I just have to leave room for, I guess there's still discovery for storytelling and for moments that, if people who are listening have read Masters and Mages, Dahlia just kept surprising me right through the novel. And Inoquez, and I won't be a spoiler on my own book, but Inoquez, I have no idea where she came from. Uh, and her somewhat pivotal effect on the book and on Aranther, yeah, that just happened. That wasn't in the outline.
Well, I think that's a lot of, especially young writers, think that outlines are restricting in some way, and that they don't want to have any sort of frame around them and just have the freedom to do whatever their creativity tells them to do. But I think what you've just shown us is that you probably need a little bit of a healthy mix of both, because if you don't have any idea where you're going, you could probably write yourself into a kind of an impossible corner. Has that ever happened to you?
No. Oddly, I have never written myself into, well, I guess I've written myself, when I say I basically had to toss 5 chapters of a book, I'd written
Right.
myself into a corner,
Yeah.
but it was a character corner. I just wasn't interested. It
Yeah.
wasn't that the plot didn't work. I have a rule of thumb. If I'm not interested, you probably won't be interested either. I just didn't, it wasn't making me feel excited. And when it's working well, and I will say Hawkwood's Sword worked well from cover to cover, um, it does feel like I'm telling myself a story, and I go to work every day going like, I wonder what's going to happen today. And that's exciting and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really,
Can I say one more thing about the frame?
please. This is your stage. Go ahead.
I think it's super important to have a frame.
Yeah.
And I think that what that means, as you neatly put it, you need to know some things. So one of the things I'm very heavy on is world building and cosmology. I'm very interested in theology, as you are. That's one of the things that made us friends.
Yeah.
And while I do not require that any world I create follow my own theology,
Yeah.
I absolutely require it to have the kind of consistency that everybody's theology, whether Hindu, Islam, whatever, everybody has fairly consistent theology. And I believe that anybody's belief system, especially if it has immanent actual gods that act in the world, the belief system better be pretty consistent.
Right.
And that's a kind of frame that, by the time you get through exactly how all that works and some geography and where the rivers flow, you've built yourself not just a world, but a frame within which you can act, and outside of which it would be foolish to act.
So it's almost like you're of the Tolkien school in some sense, because it was, Tolkien made up his language first, right? And then needed a story to tell in order for the language to make sense. So you start from the world building, and then the story comes from that?
Often. I usually have an idea. Literally, wow, I'm going to tell you all my secrets.
Please do.
Often I have an idea of how the last scene in the last book is going to look.
Fantastic.
And it's almost cinematic in my head.
Yeah.
And then from that, I draw a set of characters. And then somewhere in there, the world building starts. And then somewhere in there, I hit a giant roadblock and I realize it can't work that way because of X and Y. And I run it through and I look at various options. I'm a serious history buff. I often eat things from history that provide me with a sort of ladder to climb into my own cosmology. So I already mentioned the Greek Revolution. A few years ago, I just fell in love with the Greek Revolution because it's so fascinating. And I didn't want to write it. I actually looked at writing a historical novel, and then I decided that there were other ways of approaching this. But one of the things I really liked about the Greek Revolution that I wanted to reflect in a fantasy novel is how it was about ethnicity, but it wasn't about ethnicity. How it was about religion, but it wasn't about religion. And how very complex a world where pretty much everyone, to use modern parlance, was brown and yet subdivided themselves into ethnicities that would have been incomprehensible to an Englishman or a Russian at the time, was an excellent model for a fantasy.
No, I love that. That's such a cool idea, and it fits so well with so many of the modern issues that we're dealing with. And I wanted to expand a little bit on how you chose fantasy specifically as a genre to talk about modern problems, because I think that's a very interesting point. I think fantasy, personally, this is my belief, that fantasy is one of the most effective genres in which to tell difficult truths about this world, about our world, not about some made up thing. And so that's why I don't understand very often when people kind of attack fantasy. Most of the time, these are people who don't read fantasy, right? And attack fantasy as a kind of morbid delusion, and people who read fantasy as people who are trying to get away or escape from the modern world or from the real world, whatever that means. But I think you would agree that it's quite the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm also a science fiction fan, and no one has ever stopped science fiction from being a theater of the real world.
Yeah, exactly.
Ray Bradbury decided that for all of us back in the 60s.
Yeah.
So I always find it interesting when people levy that criticism at fantasy, because to me, I realize I'm a bit of a maverick here, but all of speculative fiction is similar. You're always world building, you're world creating. Of course, your world is going to reflect. We say about historians that most historians are just writing about themselves. You can read a 1930s history of the Middle Ages, and what you hear about is race and nationalism. And you can read a 19th century history of the Middle Ages, and what you're learning about is nationalism and law. And you can read a modern history of the Middle Ages, and you get feminism and genderism. I'm not saying that any of them are wrong. It's just that we're always talking about ourselves. So I always find it intellectually curious when people say it's just escape.
Yeah. As if just escape was even a bad thing, right? I mean, this is one of the first points that Tolkien makes in his essay on fairy stories, is that why are you begrudging the prisoner his escape from the prison of a flat materialistic reality?
Yeah.
At the very least, that's something that you should allow allow a reader. And then, of course, that's not discounting the fact that there might be other levels to this escape, not simply something superficial, right?
Well, I'm at the moment, as a reader, very much enjoying J.A. Corey's The Expanse.
Oh yeah, okay.
And I am inhaling it in a very escapist enjoyment.
Yes.
But at the same time, I am painfully aware and delightedly aware of how often he's doing a morality play about the world we live in so many ways, especially the environment and the inability of people to focus on the problem, and the willingness of people to fight each other instead of banding together to deal with actual issues.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's talking about me and the world I live in.
Yes.
And I'm still escaping. I'm still enjoying myself.
Yeah, exactly. Christian, we need to take a little bit of a technical break. If you would do me a favor, the issue is that we're going live on my page, and I don't think that the people who are following you on your page know that we're on my page. I think they're probably looking for it on your page. So would you mind doing me a favor and taking 1 second to share my author page on your author page, and tell them that we're going live on that page and not on yours? Because I'm expecting more people to show up, and right now I think it's
just send me that link.
Yeah. I'll send it to you in Facebook.
Okay, here I'm leaving you for a moment.
Yep. So those of you who are here, this is just going to be a second or two. Christian actually is going to be doing a giveaway later on in this video that we're doing. That's why I want more people to show up so that we have a larger pool from which to choose. And the deal is that you ask a question in the comment section and you're automatically entered into the drawing. So Seraphim Hegwood, I see, has already included a question. Seraphim, I will get to your question soon. I see about 9 or 10 of you are around. If you guys want to be included in the giveaway, I'm not sure exactly what book it's going to be. Christian will tell us in a second. And it might actually be 2 giveaways. We'll see. See how generous we're feeling. But yeah, in the meantime, those of you who have not heard about Christian's work, Christian, the books that I was first introduced to was something called the Traitor Son series. It's a really interesting it's a grimdark fantasy, but it's kind of deceptively not grimdark in some ways as well. It's called the Traitor Son series, the first book of which is called The Red Knight. And effectively, it's a retelling of the Arthur story, but in a very unique and interesting way that actually includes American Indians fighting together with fully armed medieval knights. It's a fantastic story. I'm going to ask Christian a little bit more about that series when he comes back. But I recommend that you check it out. It's a 5-book series. It goes on for quite a long time. And the next series after that is the Masters and Mages series, which has just recently been published completely. So, all right, Christian is back. I'm going to put you back up here. You're live now. Excellent. Okay.
And we're back.
Okay, excellent. I was just informing everybody when you were gone that you're going to be probably doing a giveaway. Is that right?
Wow, I have so many giveaways. Yes. It's a complicated giveaway. So
okay.
let me just run through. So I've got about 55 entrants so far.
Okay.
I'm giving away for free 28 millimeter figures of Aranther and Dahlia from Masters and Mages. People who want to enter for the big prize have to paint one. They don't have to paint both. They only have to paint one. And they have to supply us before about February 15th. I used to say January 20th, but it took too long to deliver the miniatures. So it's going to be February 15th. They have to supply us with some good pictures of the miniature, and I'll put up the rules online. And the best submission will win all 3 of the Masters and Mages books in hardcover in a bound special edition set of, I think there were 5 sets made.
Oh my goodness. Wow. That's fantastic.
It's about a $500 set of books. They're very, very nice.
Wow. Wonderful. Okay. Well, let's start asking questions, people. So I told the people who are listening already that if they ask a question or put in a comment, they'll be automatically included in the drawing. I hope that's okay with you.
Yep, that's absolutely fine. Anyone who puts in a question will be included, will get a miniature. They still have to paint it.
Right, exactly. Excellent. I love it. It's a fantastic idea. Okay, well, getting back to your fantasy, one of the things that really struck me about the Traitor Son series, and one of the things that really I enjoyed about it, is that even though it's firmly in the so-called grimdark genre, it has something that a lot of grimdark doesn't, and that's pageantry. And we talked a little bit about it last time, but I was really impressed by how much attention you put into cinematic scenes of triumph, and a kind of triumph of the human spirit, even though it's generally speaking, grimdark doesn't really do much of that. Was there a reason you did that?
Well, I always have certain doubts about whether I actually write grimdark.
Okay.
I think that what I write is gritty realism.
Yeah.
But realism includes joy.
Yeah.
And what I am trying to capture often is the whole experience of the fantasy world. And I don't really believe that everyone lives in a constant state of stress, tension, and horror.
Yes.
Because as a veteran and person who's experienced some stuff, you can only take so much of that, and then you're not really around anymore.
Yeah.
And that would make for an interesting kind of novel where all the main characters gradually decayed into a sort of catatonic state. But it's not a novel that I would write.
Yeah.
Also, I always want to give an image if it's a novel about conflict, of what the protagonists think they're fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
And without some image of what they're fighting for, you end up with a book that's about violence.
Yeah.
That's all it's about.
Yeah.
And sometimes about the justification of violence. And I kind of think there's more to the world than the justification of violence.
Yeah.
I could also spin you a tale about how very morally neutral violence can quickly become
Mm-hmm.
if the only definition of the bad guys is that they initially did some injury to the good guys,
Mm-hmm.
that the good guys are busy avenging. I think a moralist would say that everyone was pretty much morally on exactly the same plane there.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, and that's something that's often leveled at Grimdark, isn't it? That it's a glorification of violence.
Well, not all. And I mean, I read a lot of Grimdark, and I think a lot of it is good. And I also think that it represents revulsion with a certain other kind of fantasy that may have had a few too many unicorns. But at the same time, I would notice that a couple of the good things about Grimdark is that Grimdark tends to be very modern in its sensibilities about race and gender.
Mm-hmm.
And it wants to deal with some of the harder issues that would face any fantasy world. And it wants to rip some of the Band-Aids off and say, so what are the peasants doing?
Yeah.
What are the costs? So I wouldn't say that Grimdark was in any way bad. I enjoy it when it's well done, and a lot of it is well done. My Ed McDonald comes to mind at the moment.
Ed McDonald. Well, I'll ask you about your recommendations a little bit later. So hold on to that thought. But and not only in Grimdark, but in general. So I wanted to talk a little bit about storytelling as a kind of responsibility in a larger sense, like the responsibility of the storyteller to his readers, something that I think sometimes people don't think about enough. And it was thrown into sharp relief for me when a book club that I run over on Patreon was reading C.S. Lewis's Paralandra. It's the second book in the so-called space series. I don't know if you've read it, but it's a very interesting thing happens in the middle of the book. It's basically a retelling. For those who don't know, it's a retelling of Genesis 1, but in sort of a retelling of the recent past, and it's happening on Venus, and it's as if the fall might be happening all over again a second time, except this time there's a human being there trying to stop it. And the devil figure is presented by Lewis, who himself was a fantastic storyteller, as a consummate storyteller. And I thought that was really fascinating, that the devil was given the biggest storytelling talent in the entire story, while the main character who's supposed to stop him was terrible at telling stories, or at least wasn't able to find the storyteller within him. And I think what Lewis was trying to say, is that if you tell a bad story well, you're taking on the mantle of the devil on some level. And it made me think that maybe that's something we as storytellers should think about before we start putting words to paper. What's your immediate reaction to that thought?
I think that anybody telling a story has a duty to imagine its impact on his audience,
mm-hmm.
or her audience. That's what I think.
Okay.
And I have heard various arguments about either distancing oneself from that morality, or claiming that you could tell a very dark story as a moral example.
Mm-hmm.
And that all may be true. I just like to imagine the people who might read my books, and
mm-hmm.
I'm lucky that a lot of my friends read my books, and how this will impact them. And I'll tell you that, to me, the golden rule of leadership, and I think that when you're writing a book, you're a leader.
Yes.
And I think the golden rule of leadership is to take people where they can succeed and then let them succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And the purpose there being not just to accomplish a mission, but to make your people better people. So, yeah, I unashamedly would say, when I sit down to write a book, I hope that in some way I'm making some of my readers better people.
And that's really the difference then between storytelling and preaching, right? Because preaching, you're doing more than leading them up to a road and saying, pick one or the other. In storytelling, that's what you're doing, right? You're leading them up to a certain point, but then you leave them and you let them make their own choices about where they're going to go, right?
Yep.
And that's what's so powerful about storytelling, I think.
Yep, I agree with all of that.
So,
and I would further say, I don't want to overblow the responsibility.
Yeah.
People, I once sat with a squadron of naval aviators watching the movie Apocalypse Now, which I am absolutely certain was made to be an anti-war film.
Yeah, yeah.
No one in the room took it to be such.
Oh,
and
interesting.
In fact, the helicopter assault was played like 6 times while people laughed and cheered.
Oh my goodness.
As a sort of Northeastern Yankee liberal in the Navy, I watched all that with a smile, but I also realized as a reader and as a writer that ultimate responsibility lies with the person reading.
Yeah.
If they choose to make it a war book in their head,
yeah,
that was their choice.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it's a comforting thought as well, because I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've noticed certain trends in modern storytelling, especially in certain television series and in movies, that seem to be moving away from the kind of traditional story structures that have persisted in fairy tales and in myths for a very long time. I'm specifically thinking about the last Star Wars: The Last Jedi and Star Trek Discovery, neither of which I liked, and both of which seem to go away from those traditional structures in order to kind of tell a story of subversion. And while I think there's definitely there's definitely a place for subversive stories, but in a setting that is as mythical as Star Wars, or is as as humanitarianly positive as Star Trek, they seem to be very strange choices creatively. And being faced with those choices, which I think were at least partially motivated by questions of money, and questions of maybe even political correctness. I don't know. It almost made me think, we have to start striking back and tell more of the traditional kind of story. But I think maybe you're right. Maybe there's no need to freak out too much, because you need to let the readers decide which way they want to go.
I think what you and I share is a certain lack of cynicism. We're failures as cynics.
Yes, that's for sure. Yeah, I've tried. It doesn't work.
I just find it boring.
Yeah, I agree. Very good. So you're a lover of you're a lover of history, an amateur, or maybe even a professional historian. I don't know what you would call yourself, but in today's world where historical memory, whether it's here or whether it's in Russia, whether it's anywhere, seems to be at an ebb, what do you think is the role of history in our lives, and should we all be amateur historians?
It's a fabulous question. When people say things are at an ebb, democracy, truth, whatever, I guess as an historian, one of the first things I'd say is it in an ebb, or did we just have a sort of golden shining moment right after World War II where everybody kind of got along and academia produced some really good work and lots of people read it, and we had some really good journalists who we trusted because they'd been in the trenches in World War II along with our grandparents or our parents, and we had a trust-based society where people could get away with certain things, and now that's ebbing away. And we're returning to normalcy. That's what I would argue. I would say that most of the peasants, even wealthy, modestly literate peasants of, say, modestly prosperous 15th century England, couldn't have told you 5 things about the history of even their town.
Yeah.
And I would say that in some ways we are redolent with history now. We're all surrounded by it. It's easily accessible on the internet. The problem with democratizing all of culture. So, quick model. Culture used to be driven from the top down.
Yep.
By a handful of, I'll just call them oligarchs for fun, who pretty much decided on public taste and then paid for it so that the rest of us could just follow along and do what they said. And that seems bad.
Yeah.
Until you see the alternative. I mean, actually, I still don't think the alternative's that bad. But complete democratization devalues all the things that the oligarchs thought were valuable.
Yeah.
which includes things like criticism and aesthetics and all the things that dead white men created to decide how the universe should run. And I would add, dead white men isn't really fair, because what we really mean is rich dead white men, and occasionally rich dead white women. And they got together and decided on culture. And, they decided some things that I think were probably valuable. They also decided some things that were of very little value indeed. And now we're entering a world where every individual can decide for themselves whether the papacy of the 14th century was worthwhile or terrible.
Yeah.
And they can decide that based on really pretty powerful, good articles written on Wikipedia and constantly updated by passionate graduate students. I mean, to me, this is like historical heaven.
Yeah.
If you don't know who René d'Anjou is, you can find out in an hour. Never heard of Ivan the Terrible? You can know as much about Ivan the Terrible 15 minutes from now as anyone in Russia knew in 1825 at the most educated level of society, and you can know it on your phone. So I don't think history is dead. I think that the use we make of history and the way we regard history, and to some extent, a sort of deliberate desire to separate ourselves from history, is interesting. So I mean, I'm ranting, but
no, you're not.
it's very difficult to separate, I think, for everyone, the fact that if you are a person of color or a woman, that the past was pretty bleak in Northern Europe. I mean, definitely there were Africans in England pretty much throughout English history, but their lives weren't all that great. The lives of African-American slaves in North America during the glorious American Revolution, pretty crappy. And dwelling on that seems of very little value in a changing world where we've decided not to treat women and people of color that way. And there's very little history to support that moment. However, having made that point, I spent a lot of time studying Venice, because what I find fascinating about Venice is that Venice constantly experimented with the world we're now experimenting with: multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity, multiple religions, the acceptance of other life ways. Heck, 17th century Venice openly allowed men to be gay. Like, there was virtually no other place in Europe where that was true. And I'm not saying that Venice was paradise, but
it wasn't.
It wasn't. But it is very interesting to find that there were a couple of other places in history. At the height of the Roman Empire, they were probably the harshest slave owners who'd ever existed, but they were colorblind. And so I find that there are things in history still worth looking at. But I do understand when modern people who are attempting literally to create a new world, a world I'm in favor of, say, nah, there's nothing back there for me. We're not 19th century Russians. We're not even interested in reading about serfs. So I'll just end by saying, I think the problem to you and me and a bunch of other people I know is that while that attitude is understandable, you end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Whether what you're throwing out is craftsmanship. So if my friend Aurora Simmons were here, she'd say, yeah, but those people made beautiful things that I want to make. And whether what you're throwing out is craftsmanship or religion or even just spirituality, there are things of the past that should not be thrown out while we get rid of the baggage of racism, nationalism, and misogyny.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you. So this is more for me than perhaps for anybody else, but I find it really interesting how modern fantasy, and for a while now, has had absolutely no issue with including women in the ranks of the rank and file soldiers and women as knights, which would not have been the case in old fantasy, certainly. Now, I think for myself, and this is the question for me, I've seen, these medieval martial artist women who win championships and things like this. Actually, historically, would it have been possible for women to be knights if that were a permissible attitude in the, say, 14th, 15th century in Europe?
So two things. So first of all, I'm pretty sure I can identify one absolutely and another one probably, female knights in the 14th century. And I'm pretty sure of my historical factoid here. In 1364, I believe, the city of Siena had passed a law forbidding armed English women from coming into the market.
Which means there were armed English women coming into the market.
Yes. So like it happened. And in fact, if I had another lifetime, I'd actually like to write a book, except for modern political reasons, I want a woman to write it, called Women's Military History. About,
that'd be fascinating. That really would.
Because I have a little set of 3x5 cards because I'm old and I still like 3x5 cards of every time I run across a heroic woman, or just the casual mention of a woman in combat in a historical situation before 1800. And I have 30 very good examples. So it happened.
Yeah.
And then second, I think without getting all genderist, some of them have just been written out of history. Yeah. So my understanding, and now some naval historian is going to call me on this, is that the captain of the main top of HMS Victory, whose painting is on the ceiling of the House of Parliament in England, as Nelson lies dying on his quarterdeck, the captain of the main top was two things no one would expect out of a senior English enlisted sailor: black and a woman.
No way.
I believe, they are black in the painting, and I believe her mustering out records at Greenwich say that she was a woman. Wow. And again, a tiny fraction, but it did happen. So that's like one thing I want to say. But the other thing I want to say is, and I specified this in Cold Iron right off the bat. The biggest limitation on women serving in military roles is not women's size. It's not women's aggressiveness. It's birth control. In a world where women have no access to the control of their own fertility, most women spend most of their big, strong, healthy life having babies. That is the past. Yeah. And if women have control over their own fertility, and fantasy gives us magic, and I swear the very first thing witches would do if there were women with magical spells is create spells to provide them with control of their fertility. Yes. Then all of a sudden, the service of women as senior military leaders instantly becomes possible. And heck, there were some. You don't really have to scratch history hard to find women leading armies. It's It's women serving in armies that's rare. Right. But I believe that control of fertility would completely change the dynamic. And the last thing I want to say that I think illustrates how cultural women's service or lack there is that one thing everyone knew in the ancient world is that amongst the Scythians on the steppe, teenage girls were archers. And a good friend of mine who's quite an amazing archer, his name is Chris Vermijwaren, points out that his daughter can draw a 120-pound bow and could when she was 14. Wow. And his point, and a point I've heard made by many people, most of whom are often Ukrainian or from there, is that you can take a very small woman, put her on a horse with a bow, and she is every bit as militarily effective as a man. Yeah. If the way of your people is what the First Nations people called the way of the horse and bow, you just doubled your quote unquote manpower with your woman power. Right. Yeah. And that really happened. The Scythians rode over everyone for about 400 years.
Amazonians.
Well, yeah. And the warrior grave that was found in the Ukraine in the 30s, where when they did the genetic test in the 90s, they discovered that this 6'2" guy was a girl with the severed heads buried in her grave and stuff. Yes. I think she was a badass. Yes. So I've probably been a little long-winded here, but I honestly believed that for all fantasy writers, that if you allow your mages and your magi to settle birth control, you have no reason why women can't be major league military players.
Yeah, I mean, I think what makes people stumble very often is things like the passage in Conan Doyle's The White Company, where the sons of the archers are holding out the heavy uh, piece of wood for like 4 or 5 hours at a time, training their bodies to training their muscles at an early age, so that then they would grow up and be short, squat, and extremely strong. Or the swordsmen in a novel such as what is Enchanted, I think, by Orson Scott Card, which is partially set in medieval Russia, where he makes I think he believes, historical point that the swordsmen, led the actual sort of enforcers in early Rus, would have been as wide as they were tall, right? So it's not everybody that could wield a sword that size, like a greatsword, for example. So I think that maybe that's what trips people up sometimes. Like, oh, a woman can't pick up that sword. It's not possible, right?
So I'm going to make a further point, because we had some fabulous experiments at WMAW this year.
Okay.
With 50 on 50 fighting with safe sport equipment, but pretty real weapons, not plastic weapons, not rattan weapons. And I'm sure this sort of thing has been done before, but the thing I noticed most is how little effect martial arts skill, strength, or size has in keeping you alive in a large fight. And I think that we watch too many Hollywood movies, and we forget that the way to win a battle is to have the best fed army, which has had the most sleep and has the most confidence, facing the worst fed, least sleep. And really, having all your guys be 6'6" by 6'6" will build confidence, but it won't win any battles. And it sure as hell won't win battles against people with heavy crossbows or pikes. I was actually in a fight long time ago in the SCA where a vengeful and annoyed baron armed all the women of his barony with long spears, and it was then demonstrated why Swiss pikemen ran over just about everybody in the late 14th and early 15th century. You give people a 20-foot pike, they really don't need to be that big, because all of the pike points from being 16 deep mean that your giant swordsman is faced with a wall of steel points, and they just die.
Yep.
Being heroic is at large can just make you a bigger target. When the 14-year-old Scythian girl rides by and flips 5 arrows off her fingers onto her bow, if you're a 5x5, you just took up more space for the arrows coming in.
That's right. Exactly right. That's awesome. I love it. All right, let's go a little bit towards technical stuff. So you famously write in a cafe. How is it? Is it the cafe that makes you productive, or is it the habit that makes you productive? How is it that you force yourself to just go sit down and write words no matter what?
It's a job. And if I don't do it, I don't make any money. And then I don't pay my mortgage, and my wife is angry. That's it. My father, who's been a writer all his life, says that nothing focuses the mind of the writer like poverty. And I've always found that to be true. But yes, I like to be comfortable when I write. I like good coffee. I hate bad coffee. I drank so much bad coffee in the military, I sort of swore I wasn't going to drink bad coffee anymore. And and I'm just going to add to that yes, it is habit. I mean, you're totally right about that. I want to be in my seat by 8:30. I'm not always, but I'd like to be there at 8:30. I'd like to be able to leave at 2:30, because there's all these annoying things in real life that aren't writing, like paying your bills and getting the Christmas lights on the outdoor trees and decorating your Christmas tree and actually talking to your family. I don't know. All these things take up time. Just going to the post office can eat an hour. What I'm saying there is I have found a slot in the day where I can be productive through the whole slot. And I've created a whole sort of world to focus my writing. But I think I said this the last time we were together, and I don't want to bore anybody who's listening, but writing is an everything is everything situation. Like,
Mhm.
I am always doing research. I am always writing my plots in my head. Whether I'm gaming, playing role-playing games, reenacting, going on vacation to castles and whatever, I am always, while I was doing cons in England, I was running around to archaeological sites because I'm always on. Like, it's always happening.
Mhm.
And it doesn't all end up in the books, but so much of it does that it's literally a lifestyle.
Is that something that you chose to do consciously before you started writing, or is it a result of you being a writer?
Yep. It's definitely one of those. I think I'm a method writer, the way some actors are method actors.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I always want to know more. I'm never satisfied. I'm pretty sure that if someone would pay me a large amount of money, I'd just do research always, and someone else could write the books, but that hasn't come clean yet. No one has said, Christian, you do all the research and I'll split my royalties with you. No one has said that. But I'm passionately interested in how things work. And that extends perfectly into fantasy. I know not everyone agrees. I actually got in an argument at Worldcon, and I completely understand the other side. I'm not dissing it, but I want fantasy to work. I mean, even though I can't cast spells, I want them to work in my head so that they make sense to me. And sometimes I have to do research to get there. Sometimes sometimes it comes into my head. I do make things up, but sometimes I need to read an old manuscript about how people thought magic worked to have a better idea of how I want my magic to work.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you then sit in place for those 6 hours or whatever that is the entire time, or do you get up? How do you keep from getting tired?
I never get up. I can tell how much I never get up by how much my legs hurt at the end.
There you go.
So many things you young writers have to look forward to at age 57. It is especially crushing to run in the morning and then write all day, because at the end of the day, my legs are so unforgiving. Anyway, I hardly ever get up. Yeah,
Okay.
I just sit there and write. And
you don't get tired.
I usually have a stack of books that I'm constantly looking things up in. I have my cell phone, which I basically use as a Wikipedia lookup tool. If I have to go deeper than Wikipedia on any subject, happens to me all the time, I just make myself a note, put a line of X's and a self note on my manuscript. Like, before I write this scene, I need to know where Charles of Navarre was in December of 1370.
Nice.
Skip to the next scene, and I make a list of those, and then I give myself some of my favorite days where I go to a library or a research center, and all I do all day is satisfy all my requests. I call them intelligence requests. I'm investigating the past, and I just sit there and write myself little notes, and then I go back and write all that back in.
So, I mean, that's amazing. You must just be high energy as a person, and just naturally, because I don't know, I like after 2 or 3 hours sitting in front of a screen, my eyes just feel like they're starting to bleed out, and I want to get up and run around and lift things.
You should drink better coffee.
Yeah, probably. But I live in the middle of nowhere. We don't have good coffee.
You know what? I usually don't even notice the time going by when I'm writing, because I'm telling myself a story. It just goes by. Usually about 1:30 or 1:45, I get hungry and I start to flag and I stare at the screen, and then I have to make a decision. Do I stop now, or do I basically eat something and have a second period? Yeah. And sometimes it's very productive and sometimes it's really crappy. So I'm a little careful of that second period.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you're beginning a new scene or a chapter or starting to write a new character, you're probably already doing it automatically because you've been writing so often. But can you remember if you had any specific techniques that you used to frame a character within a scene properly?
Well, first of all, I'm going to admit that almost all my major characters are based on people I know. They aren't necessarily people I know well. They are never characters from movies or, well, no, I've heard people use like sort of movie personas, and I could see that, but I try to use real people. One of the great advantages of having had a military career is that I met a lot of very interesting people, some of whom were quite strange, and all of whom make great characters. And I have never in my life thought of how to frame a character.
You just did it.
So maybe I suck at it.
No, probably not.
But I did go to an excellent school taught by Jesuits where we had to do character studies all the time, where we'd have to write off in a paragraph or a page or 5 pages a character. And I remember very clearly the very first time I was challenged to do that in, I think, freshman year high school. I had just gone to my first reenactment. So I completely focused on this person's clothes because I just discovered historical costume like for the first time. and the guy who taught the class, he gave me a good grade, but he said, this is, you said a lot through the clothes, but you didn't really tell me who this person was. And I learned a fair amount from that. But I got to tell you, I have a huge cheat, a life hack, which is my dad is a writer. So I literally grew up with this. My mom did a ton of writing. My dad's best friend is a writer. Like, it was all around me all my life. And then I'd say everyone has a different hack. Reading. You want to be a better writer? Do more reading. And for character writing especially, when I run dry, and I have definitely run dry, I tend to peek at classic 19th century novels. They may be full of racism and misogyny, but man, those writers knew how to bring out a character in no lines. Like Jane Austen can tell you what a rotten dead fish the visiting vicar is in one line of conversation.
It's true.
And this is amazing. And when you're writing a 5 or 10,000 word short story or something, it doesn't hurt to just flip through Jane Austen for a few pages. I'm not saying copy Jane Austen. I'm just saying, remember how Jane gets you there in one line.
Maria Bogos says Dostoevsky for the win.
Well, I thought of mentioning Dostoevsky. It took me a long time to like Dostoevsky, but I grew up eventually, and there we all were.
Good. Yes.
But I just reread a ton of Tolstoy last year, and Tolstoy also has that magical, you meet those characters in War and Peace, and in seconds, especially his soldiers, they just ride by or take off their greatcoats, and you're like, I know that guy. I know.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, Tolstoy is obviously the better stylist, and Dostoevsky's got that more of that, visceral quality to him. But they're both amazing. It's absolutely true. For all of the words that they wrote, I mean, those novels can be incredibly long. It's not that they were wordy or didn't know how to set a scene properly. It's because they were paid by word, right? But they could do it in a sentence. They could do it in 25 pages, whatever suited their purposes.
And I'm going to go back to Conan Doyle. I love Conan Doyle, and in fact, I wrote the Chivalry series because I loved The White Company so much. But
I love that book so much. Such a great book.
Conan Doyle doesn't know a thing about how medieval warfare worked, or how war bows worked, or how fighting in armor worked. So I wouldn't take his view on how you train archers as being any kind of, I know of a bunch of guys and gals who can draw a 140-pound warbow, and none of them stand around holding out large billets of wood for a really long time.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, some more technical stuff. So when you write, do you write primarily for character or for plot, or is there no difference between the two?
There's this guy, Aristotle.
Yes.
and Aristotle wrote a roadmap based on Plato of what I think it's drama, of how good drama should be written. And my dad taught me the Aristotelian hierarchy of I call it fiction. I think I was 9 or maybe 10.
That's amazing.
So I always end up saying this, especially to younger writers. And at Worldcon, we're all sitting around drinking beer, and somebody asked me the same question, and I'm like, Aristotle? And most people did, actually. In fact, what I found fascinating was how many other fantasy authors were like, oh yeah, the Aristotelian hierarchy. But so I actually believe that you build characters build motivation, and their motivations build the plot.
Yeah.
And
I think you're right. Yeah.
But I also want to say that the real world doesn't have a plot. And also the real world has background and foreground events, so that it can be more important to you on a given day, whether you're balancing your checkbook, than whether the president of the United States was impeached that day. But the impeachment of the president of the United States is there in the background. You are aware of it, and it has an effect.
Yeah.
And that is something that is not in Aristotle's hierarchy.
Yeah.
So here's my thing. I build my characters first, and I know what I want them to do. And I give them motivations. Sometimes they give me motivations. Sometimes they have surprising motivations. Those motivations build plot. But at the same time, there is usually a background plot. It's not quite an arc.
Yeah.
And it may not fully ever engage the characters. So often it does, especially in fantasy. But in my historical novels, often, especially with William Gould that I just wrote, he's a player, but he is not the main player. He may be the protagonist to you and me, but he's not driving that over plot.
Right.
And that is a little bit of a departure from Aristotle.
Yeah.
So his motivations are driving his plot. Yeah. But across the background, there's a gigantic, almost world war, Europe-wide war going on, in which he is only a bit player.
Right. Right. No, it's true, and that's because of the limitations of Greek drama, and he believed that the drama, or specifically tragedy, was the highest form of art, but that's what makes part of what makes his book so amazing, is that in spite of that limitation, and it's rather a large limitation, that structure still works incredibly well. And you're right, to add that level of complexity that you're talking about doesn't diminish still his point about how character motivations create plot. It's a really, really good point, and I'm glad you said it, because because this is exactly what I needed to hear today, based on some things that I need to do tomorrow. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I'm pretty sure I'm going to be super arrogant and put words in Aristotle's mouth. That if Aristotle read modern novels, he'd say, "Oh, that's okay. All that stuff you're talking about is actually scenery." Yeah. Yeah. Because it's still a drama. The tragedy is about the characters.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're right.
And I don't want people to think that the 100 Years' War and all the wars in Italy are really scenery, but they really are. They're just scenery. You can read about them on Wikipedia. You don't need William Gould.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's not why you read historical novels, really. It's to see how people react to those things. But yeah, so let's get to some of the. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, but let's get to some of the questions that people have actually asked in advance. Otherwise, it'll be me monopolizing you the whole time. So let's get into this list of questions that we have. I'm going to start with the ones that were sent in advance, and then we'll go to the comments as asked during the actual conversation. Here's a question: what is a skill you feel everyone should have but few do?
Now, is this a writing skill? Or
no,
real life
I don't think so. I think this is just life skill.
Cutting wood with an axe.
Nice. Why?
Well, first of all, it's fabulous for your swordsmanship.
Oh, yeah.
Second of all, it's super useful if you're camping. I don't want to be too derogatory, but I've met a number of survivalists who are going to survive, and they have fabulous guns and no axe. And I always think, so they're going to kill other people for firewood. That's their plan.
Or threaten them, hold them at gunpoint while the other people chop their wood for them.
Yeah. And then I often watch people who think they can cut firewood and they can't. And that's sad, because it's not that hard, but it is just hard enough to rank as a skill. And and it's worth being able to do well because then it's quick and efficient. And one thing I've noticed camping with other people all my life is that if you can cut firewood efficiently, you can get out of a lot of yuckier chores.
It's true. Yeah, it's true. All right, another question. Who would win in a fight with no magic between Gabriel Murians and William Gold?
William Gold.
Aha, that was quick.
Yeah.
So Gabriel's too dependent on his magic, huh?
No, he's too young, and he really hasn't. He spends time training, but he's too arrogant to train well.
Yeah.
Whereas William Gold, because of I actually created William Gold this way because his early life tanks, because he fails and has to rebuild himself and rebuild his idea of himself and his ego. He's actually sort of the ideal tackling dummy for Fiore. So he's actually brilliantly well trained.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Gabriel is a lot of arrogance and some training.
Mostly arrogance, let's be honest. But it's what makes him so lovable.
A delight to write. Yes.
Oh, a delight to read too. He was a great character. Will you go back to fantasy after the completion of Masters and Mages and the Traitor Son saga? We've talked about this a little bit, but maybe you can give some more information. The question goes on to say either expand those universes, other main characters, or a prequel, or maybe create a new one.
So I'm almost certainly going to write Bronze Age based trilogy or maybe more.
Nice.
It is a very created world. So if Traitor Son was a transparently historical 14th century with magic, and if Masters
and American Indians,
and Masters and Mages was a less historical, more fantasy based, non-European, this will be fantasy almost to the point of seeming like science fiction.
Oh, wow.
In a Bronze Age world where my shout line is 4,000 years ago, good and evil had the ultimate battle. Evil won.
Ooh. Okay. Wow.
And I think it's the best idea I've ever had. I don't want to give away the whole thing, but it's how evil and failure are gradually undermined to try and create some sort of life for people. But
that's amazing. Wow.
It's not even, it's so much more complicated than that.
Yeah. Is there a timeline for this, or is this still an idea phase?
I'll probably start writing in May. And I want to reduce myself to one historical and one fantasy a year. I want to stop writing so many books. So I would imagine that you'll see the first one in 2021.
That's actually not so long away, considering the schedules of traditional publishing these days. Although I guess you can probably skip a lot of those because you have such a good relationship with your publisher.
And then if if that series is modestly successful, I would actually like to go back to Aranther and Dahlia.
Yeah.
Eventually, and not for money, I would like to write one more Traitor Son Red Knight novel called After the Gates. And the Christmas story is sort of a taste of what that might be like.
Yeah.
I don't want to write another trilogy. I don't want to write 5 more books. I don't want to reinvent the crisis, because the crisis is past. But I want to demonstrate how everything's always a crisis. So I'd like just to show the mechanisms that Gabriel died to allow happen, mostly working, as people try to govern themselves and live with the monsters and live with the wild and give the wild some of its own governance. I just kind of like to write a novel about how that worked. It's almost that's why it's called After the Gates, So now, then what happens?
Yeah, that sounds fun. After the war's over. That's not something that many fantasy writers attempt. I imagine it's pretty hard.
Well, think about World War II took 5.5 years to fight out to its conclusion, but we're just about finishing with the political fallout now.
It's true. Yeah. Plenty of good story ideas there. Absolutely. Speaking of story ideas, Seraphim here asks in the comment section, do you ever find story ideas in suddenly meeting a suggestive image in real life or in the imagination?
Absolutely.
Like like Lewis's Narnia sprung from a mental image of a fawn standing with packages and an umbrella under a lamppost in the snow in the wood.
Yeah. So I think I have said before on this program, i.e. to you, that I have this wonderful experience that I call art makes art. So I can go to a concert. Ballet usually does it for me in seconds. My mind drifts. It's kind of because I both like and don't like ballet. It's hard to explain, but my mind drifts, and in that drifting, suddenly immense creativity happens. Like
Wonderful.
much more rapid, much more unfocused. But anyway, and often it has to do with something on stage or in an art gallery or in a painting. Also, from time to time, I hope this isn't embarrassing because I'm going from the sublime to the everyday, but sometimes Instagram coughs up some fantasy artist who has just done a brilliant rendering of something, and I go, wow, that's cool. And let me appall you by saying gaming. Once in a while, something happens in a game that is so, it's a little like the fawn with the umbrella that it happens, and I go, that's going. So when I say I run a Cold Iron campaign, and I do, I run a role-playing game based on, I think people imagine that, oh, those are the characters and they're, somebody was playing a Ranther. No, it's not like that at all. But one thing happened one time in that campaign that I went, bang, wow, that's better than anything I could think of. So what I'm trying to say is, in a variety of aspects, absolutely yes.
Fantastic. There's one or two more questions here in the comments. Let me make sure to get them. There was a halfway question from John Super when I was talking about Star Wars and the new kinds of storytelling. He says, are these types of stories that don't allow the reader viewer to make the choice of what to do with the moral dilemma, such as the new Star Wars, doing violence to the story by being too preachy and essentially dogmatic in determining the virtues they're trying to communicate? I think it's a really interesting, comment question, because the new Star Wars, The Last Jedi, was supposed to be, the ultimate modern subversion of, the old-fashioned classical tropes. And yet I think there's something to what John is saying here about what ended up happening at the end of The Last Jedi is there was no story left to tell. So I haven't watched the new Star Wars yet. It's coming out tomorrow. But a lot of the early reviews are saying that the first hour of the new Star Wars movie is exposition for a brand new disaster, because Star Wars 2 had destroyed the story completely by doing exactly this, by being essentially dogmatic in determining the storyline for the reader and not allowing it to go anywhere else. What do you think about that?
I'm going to appall you and say I haven't watched any of the Star Wars movies.
Good for you. Don't.
No. I went to the first one, which I guess we now call the fourth one. I don't know. Yeah. I'm old. I went to the first one, and I think I saw it like 31 times. Greatest movie of my youth. And I thought The Empire Strikes Back was fine, and I thought Return of the Jedi was almost fine. And at some point, like, I can't even remember. I was still in the Navy, and the new first episode came out, and I watched it, left the movie theater, and thought, well, I'll never need to do that again.
Yeah, it's only gotten worse.
and so I just lost it. And I'd also say that even as a 16-year-old, I had some doubts about the message of the first one.
Okay.
Loved the action scenes, loved the lightsabers. Couldn't help but notice that these Jedi Knights who call themselves knights have no real sense of chivalry. There's like dark ones who seem to have no rules whatsoever. And mostly they kill each other and never stop to talk.
Yep. It's true. It's a good point. Here's a question from me, while other people still are putting things in the comment section. There's something that struck me about your world building in the Traitor Son series, and it's the following. Okay, so you decided to use Renaissance Hermeticism as kind of the basis for your power system, for your magic system, right? And what's interesting about that is that everything there is based on hierarchies of power and how you can use your magic to get power over others. And yet, since it's set in a 14th century world, Christianity is an important force, at least to some degree, right? But Christianity is ultimately, or it claims to be about abandonment of power, and yet your version of it was about acquiring power. Was there any reason you did that, and how did you work that kind of tension?
I don't. I always hate disagreeing with you, but I don't actually think that a 14th century person would have seen any difference. And I'm not sure that a 14th century person would have seen any abandonment of power in Christianity.
Uh-huh.
When one talks of the Blessed Virgin Mary as the Queen of Heaven, one
Yeah.
has just launched oneself into a feudal hierarchy in
Yeah.
which the King and Queen of Heaven sit in thrones judging you.
Okay.
With the Greeks still call the Archangel Michael Taxiarchos,
Yes.
the commander of the Taxis, the
Mhm.
literal phalanx of angels. Like
Yeah.
it's an image. Talk about images that I love. I
Yeah.
love the image of 40 or 50,000 perfectly formed angels with
Mhm.
their pikes in a phalanx.
Mhm.
What Satan has no chance at all.
Yep.
But
That's right.
the point I'm trying to get around to is I think it was pretty hierarchical to them. And,
Mhm.
one of the things I try to make clear by almost always referring to Jesus as Jesu, by
Mhm.
using antique language and by deliberately introducing very scholastic ideas of
Mhm.
Christianity, is that this is not our Christianity. I didn't want
Yeah.
anybody to be offended, evangelical, Catholic, whatever. And I actually got a couple of fairly nasty anti-fan notes from people saying, you don't seem to know the first thing about Christianity.
Yeah.
But what I was trying to portray is how, to me,
Mhm.
late 14th century people thought Christianity worked.
Yeah, that
And
makes sense.
I think they believed it was a magical
Yeah.
hierarchy,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, with a lot of power acquirable by repeatable magic spells called prayers.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. That's a really interesting point. Now, I hadn't thought about that because, of course, when you're reading fantasy, you're assuming that the writer is saying something about the modern world, but it's a historically based fantasy at the same time. So you're doing both, right? You're depicting the
I'm
points of
playing
view
in
of
both
people
games
yeah,
because at the same time, Amicia is basically weirdly both a sexy woman and a living saint.
yep,
A point I was trying to make from the get-go about her.
right,
And she would be a living saint in anybody's culture. In
yeah,
fact, I sort of say that about her. Like when she
yeah,
was an outwaller, she was still a mystical figure. And
yeah,
if she were in your living room, she'd still be a mystical figure. This
yeah,
is somebody who would be a living saint. And so she's a modern figure,
yeah,
and she's uninterested. I mean, I'm not trying to make myself a great writer here, but you'll notice she's not interested in the trappings of power at all.
yeah. That's
She
right.
just wants to function within her world and make people better.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
the point there is she's the most actually religious person,
Yeah,
at least
yeah,
by our standards, in
yeah,
the
yeah.
entire book.
Yeah. True. Very true. Excellent. So a few more questions came in the meantime. Mario Bagos says, how does one successfully depict the interiorization of the hero's journey reflected in most traditional folk tales, etc.? On the one hand, there are the external battles and victories depicted in most stories, but what about depicting the inner transformation of characters? That's a good question.
It's an excellent question.
Yeah.
I prefer to let the reader see it than to have the. So I'm going to use William Gold as an example, even though he's not fantasy, because I tell him in the first person. Or
Mhm.
Aramnestos, my Greek character. I think they both very clearly go on journeys. I think they both grow enormously,
Mhm.
but they, I hope, almost never tell you about it. In fact, I just killed off an internalization in the very last pages of my William Gold novel, where I actually had him thinking about his own failings, and I realized that that was making it too easy on the reader. The
Uh-huh.
reader's got to see that.
Yeah.
Um, Show it, don't say it is. I believe in that. I believe in a lot of old aesthetic rules.
Yeah.
I'm a very old person, uh, but I So I want that internal journey to happen, but you've got to see it through a person's actions,
Mhm.
um, and speeches. But you can't. I feel you can't just say suddenly William realized that all his life he
Yeah.
had been indulging in violence simply to hide from himself his shallow personality. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know, but
Yeah.
um, partially because I don't believe anybody suddenly realizes anything, and that most of us realize things about ourselves 80 or 90 times before we actually take any action.
Yeah.
And
That's
that
true.
would be super boring in a book.
Yeah, for
Once
sure.
again, once again, William realized, you know,
Yeah, exactly. Excellent.
I
Uh,
do have a nun at one point, one of his best friends, say, you went on a pilgrimage and you used the pilgrimage as the basis of a military campaign. That's who you are.
yeah.
That was not a genuine religious experience. And I hope the reader gets from that William is chagrined to discover that he has not been a good pilgrim.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to have him think, oh, woe is me. I was a bad pilgrim. Anyway,
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And the question is good because because I think a lot of people respond viscerally to the format of the fairy tale because it's so epic, it's so mythical, and it doesn't get into that internal sort of part of the human consciousness. But it's difficult to replicate that in modern fiction because people want to be in the heads of the main character and understand what's going on. So you have to kind of walk a fine line because that's what the problem with a lot of so-called literary fiction is, that it's little more than navel gazing. At least that's what I think.
uh, I'm absolutely going to agree with you there. I think, yeah, maybe I'm just being too complicated. I want you to know that those thoughts are there, but I want you to draw them out of the character's actions
Yeah.
or maybe other thoughts he has.
Yeah.
It is possible to see change in characters when they stop thinking about something or when they stop wanting something.
Yeah. In fact, sometimes those are the most powerful moments.
Also, I'm very sensitive when writing my more military characters that having an internal life is a product of an intellectual lifestyle that is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
actually even conducive to surviving a world of violence and war.
It's true. Yeah.
So I want William Gould and Gabriel Murray and Aranther. Aranther has more of an internal life than I've ever allowed any other character.
But he's
But
young, so it's fine.
well, he's also trained as an intellectual.
Yeah.
He's going to university.
Yeah.
So he's not just a killer. But for my killers, I try to, they're smart people, so I want them to have thoughts, but I don't want to lie to the reader about what I think it's like to be a day-to-day killer.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's one of the. I mean, it's what I love about the stories that you tell is that, well, you allow the humanity of all of those people to come through, without judgment and without suggesting your own ideas about what they should be doing. They just are. They are who they are.
Yep. Thank you. The highest compliment you've ever paid.
You're welcome. Mario says, thanks for the answer. Very interesting. So does this mean a character's psychology should be mostly shown? Thinking of some books we read recently. We are reading Crime and Punishment, and Dostoevsky really paints the interior life of Raskolnikov to an unsettling degree, but it's still great. That being said, in Lord of the Rings, we can infer inner life of the characters from the actions and thoughts very well. Aragorn's behavior before and after gazing into the Palantir, for example. How about combining both approaches? There's a lot of questions in there.
And I'm just going to say that's for another writer who's writing a different thing. I'm all down. I'm all down on that great 19th century examination of the inner self.
Yeah.
I love reading it. It's just not how I write.
Yeah.
And I can imagine writing a character who had enormous internal life. And I think in a small but very real way, the Christmas story you're going to read on Christmas Eve, you're going to find that the protagonist, who is not entirely confident and not entirely sure of herself, has more inner life than you're used to getting from me. I'm not against it. It's just not the way I treat some of these characters. Also, I feel sometimes, in as much as we have plots, you can give too much plot away in a character's inner life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
true.
not a problem. That's not a problem for a 19th century Russian writer.
Right.
Because
exactly. Yeah. But it doesn't read very well in modern novels. People don't appreciate it. Most readers don't appreciate that sort of thing in a contemporary novel, and that's for those of you who are writers. It doesn't work. It's much more difficult to recreate in a modern way the thing that Dostoevsky did with his psychological characters, just because there's a lot less patience, I think, for the reader, and because they're so used to seeing things in a cinematic way, and so that precludes the ability for the reader to sit for pages upon pages and paragraphs that last a page and a half, basically, going through a person's emotional and mental state. So it's difficult to do, certainly.
But I'm going to give you an example of someone who does it very successfully. It's a different genre, but one I love. P.D. James. P.D. James is a mystery writer. Yep. I love her stuff. I love it. And it you can I will often put down a P.D. James novel, look around a coffee shop, and everyone looks like an alien, including me, because her examination of the world is so detailed and unsettling that you begin to go like, oh, everybody has these meanings to everything they say. Again, I admire it in others. It just doesn't happen to be my pony.
Yeah, fair enough. So what I want to end with is your recommendations for unexpected books that go beyond the merely escapist and delve a little deeper into what it means to be human, whether that's psychologically, theologically, philosophically, whatever that might be. Give me like 3 or 4 or 5 books.
Oh dear.
Yes, you on the spot.
So this is a little different from just telling you that, for instance, I love John Gwynne. So I'm going to start out with Jeanette Ng's novel Pendulum Son.
Pendulum Son.
So Pendulum Son, she won the Joseph Campbell Award. I mean, like, everyone should know who she is by now. But I want to say this about it. Everything about it is unexpected. And if I told you that it was the story of Anglican missionaries attempting to convert fairies in a completely steampunk 19th century alternate England, where the fairies actually have no souls and thus can't be converted. And if I further added that the Anglican missionaries aren't bad people and that her understanding of the Anglican religion is spot on perfect theologically, I loved it. I loved like every page, and everything was unexpected, and I'm not going to give away anymore.
No, don't.
It is the best fantasy novel I've ever read that had no sword fights in
it. Fantastic. All right, give us 1 or 2 more of those.
Ben Aronovich, I probably needs no push from me, but Rivers of London, Anyway, I read one because Ben has been very nice about saying nice things about me. And I thought I should really read one of his books. And like 5 nights later, I could not be pulled away I just dropped into that world. And I love London. Maybe if you don't love London, they're harder to read. But everything about it was unexpected. And I guess what I adored was his use of fairy tale, myth, and legend, the day-to-day legends of England, into broad plot, just incredible. So the idea that there's naiads living in every river in the modern world, and they have the personalities of brilliant stuff. The way his magic system works, everything about it. That was absolutely lovely. I'm trying to think. Dan Kelly has a book called, is it Heroes of Troy? Oh, he's going to kill me for my not remembering the title. But I loved it because I never expect to enjoy anyone else's Greek or Greek-themed fantasy or historical fiction. And that sounds bad. That makes me sound like an arse. But it's because I do a ton of research, so I'm often stopped dead by
Right.
things that you don't need to worry about the rest of the world.
Right.
And I wasn't stopped dead. And in fact, by page 86, I couldn't put it down. So that was unexpected. It's not unexpected the way the Pendulum Son went, but I'm trying to like, it's been a good year for fantasy. I read a lot of good books this year, but I'll just leave you with those.
All right. You had mentioned Ed McDonald before. Is there something in particular that you wanted to recommend?
Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I got his first one as an ARC, and everything about his world building was everything that Grimdark ought to be. And that's with me saying I'm not sure I'm a Grimdark writer.
Right.
But from the relative despairing hopelessness of the situation of humanity to the dark satanic mills, it's like William Blake knew how to write a sword fight and jumped with both feet into world building.
Seriously, that's the best blurb I've ever heard. What's the
again? I'm sorry, I read so many, and it was 2 years ago on Rhodes. I was in Rhodes in Greece that I read it. Raven, Black Raven. Oh, he's gonna kill me. Hopefully, he'll never hear this broadcast.
That's okay. I'll share all of these titles. I'll look these titles up and share them properly on my blog, and I'll share the blog with you. So
okay, I'm really sorry. I think I'm just tired, and I was not ready for that question, or I'd have the physical books to wave at you.
That's okay. My fault. I should have warned you in advance. But I like to be naughty and throw these questions at people just to see how they react. So anyway, I think that's it. Raven Black.
I've got one more. Wait,
I've
got one more.
Okay.
But I don't think it's like Ben Aronovich, Nick Eames, Kings of the Wild.
Yeah.
Most surprising novel I read 2 years ago, I think. Just because I loved Nick, but I didn't expect to enjoy the book because I'm like, rock bands as mercenary bands. And then it's so beautiful and the characters are so well done. So you were talking about character. It is character driven. It is Aristotle would have approved from beginning to end. And like each scene is like a beautiful set piece. So also I wasn't surprised because I'm so high and mighty. I was just surprised because it got so deep while being so apparently not deep.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm talking about. That's exactly. So I'm glad you mentioned that, 'cause that's the sort of thing that I'm interested in bringing out. There are a few people who looked up Ed McDonald's stuff, and they said it's the Raven's Mark series, and there's two novel titles that they offered. One of them is Blackwing, and the other one is Raven Cry.
Blackwing is the first one.
Yeah. So we'll start with that one, and then the rest we can. Yeah. Excellent. Christian, this has been, as always, an incredible pleasure. We're basically done with the questions, and it's late, and I think we all need to go to bed. But thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. And just for all of you watching, I will ask you to direct message me in Facebook, those of you who left comments and asked questions, so then I can send your addresses over to Christian, and he can
exactly. And I'll make sure you get a miniature. I'm going to say one more thing about the miniatures, just because I've got maybe some people watching. The miniature, are we going to post this, by the way? Are you going to put it up on Facebook?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So let me just say, it's now the Christmas season. The mails are going to move like they're not going to move. So I'm going to ask people, when you get your miniature in the mail, just tell me you got it. And when I've received a few of those, I will actually post the date that the contest is due. Because I have a feeling that it could be like January before anybody gets their miniature, and that will make me feel bad. So if people would just say, hey, Christian/Miles, I got my miniature today and it's January 6th or whatever, that would help me decide how much time to give everyone to paint them.
Awesome. Perfect. Well,
thanks Nathan.
Absolutely. And I'm going to stop the live video right now, but don't go anywhere because we can still talk afterwards a little bit. All right. Thanks everybody for coming by. This video will be posted on Facebook and on my blog in a little bit, but you've already watched it. So anyway, thanks for coming by, everybody.